Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking a story that is, well, it's as heartbreaking as it is absolutely fascinating. We're looking at the complex trajectory of Rwanda, a nation that has experienced the literal darkest depths of human cruelty, and yet somehow has engineered one of the most stunning national turnarounds of the 21st century.
Right off the bat, you'll see there's this profound duality to modern Rwanda. On one hand, you have this idealized perception, the Switzerland of Africa. And honestly, the stats back it up. It boasts an astonishing 10 to 11% real GDP growth in recent years, and its capital, Kigali, is widely celebrated as the cleanest city in Africa. It's an absolute miracle of economic and social recovery. But, and this is a big but, this idyllic current state masks a really turbulent history. Researchers call it cyclic state failure. It's a history defined by highly stratified societies, authoritarianism, and deep-seated oppression. To really get Rwanda today, we've got to uncover this hidden past.
So let's jump into part one, constructing the divide, the origins of ethnicity. Let's look at the roots of these divisions and how they would eventually tear the country apart.
Now, you might be wondering, were these groups always at each other's throats? Actually, no. What's truly fascinating is that the infamous ethnic divisions of Rwanda, the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, were not originally rigid racial blood feuds. Pre-colonially, these were kind of like fluid socioeconomic roles. The Hutu were predominantly Bantu farmers. The Tutsi were a cattle-keeping aristocracy with a centralized kingship, and the Twa were indigenous potters and forest dwellers. Sure, there was a hierarchy, and the Tutsi minority definitely held aristocratic power, but there was a balance. In fact, an individual could acquire cattle and essentially, become Tutsi. It was a fluid social fabric based way more on livelihood and wealth than anything else.
But that fluidity, it changed drastically when European powers showed up. It sparked, as the quote here points out, a pattern of oppression where disparate institutions were grafted onto an unprepared society. First the Germans in the 1890s, and then the Belgians after World War I looked at Rwanda's social structure and basically weaponized it. They needed local administrators for their policy of indirect rule, to collect taxes, keep order, the whole shebang. So they exclusively empowered the Tutsi elite, freezing what had been a flexible class system into a rigid, oppressive hierarchy.
Let's walk through how fast this happened. This rapid colonial interference was a real game changer, and not in a good way. After the Belgian takeover, they went a step further. In 1933, they formalized the divide by issuing ethnic ID cards based on arbitrary physical traits. No more fluidity, you were permanently stamped as Hutu or Tutsi. This is your classic colonial divide and rule tactic, and it bred massive resentment. The colonialists pushed this myth of Tutsi racial superiority, systematically marginalizing the Hutu majority. And the result? By 1959, that pressure cooker exploded into a violent Hutu rebellion against the Tutsi aristocracy.
Which brings us to part two, the breaking point, from 1959 to 1994. The rigid hierarchy built by colonial powers set the stage for decades of horrific, cyclical revenge.
So following the 1959 revolution, Rwanda gains independence in 1962, but power had violently shifted. Hutu elites took exclusive control, and they set up an exclusionary regime that drove hundreds of thousands of Tutsis into exile in neighboring countries. Fast forward a few decades to 1990. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, which was formed by Tutsi exiles in Uganda, invaded Rwanda to reclaim their homeland. This sparked a brutal civil war. And then, the tension reached its absolute breaking point. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying the Hutu president was shot down. That assassination? That was the spark that ignited the genocide.
The sheer gravity of what happened next is, well, it's incredibly difficult to comprehend. The genocide wasn't some spontaneous, organic eruption of violence. It was a meticulously planned program by extreme Hutu nationalists. Just stop and think about this number for a second. In just 100 days, bands of militias hunted down and slaughtered an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. It was literally one of the fastest, most brutal genocides in recorded human history. Neighbors turned on neighbors, the violence spared absolutely no one. Not women, not children, not the elderly.
And through all of this horrific violence, the international community completely failed Rwanda. It's absolutely crucial to understand that despite having clear intelligence, despite widespread media coverage, the world essentially just watched. United Nations peacekeeping troops on the ground were stalled out, deeply underfunded, and legally constrained from stepping in. Meanwhile, the US and other Western powers actively halted military interventions, choosing to be passive bystanders. The UN even failed to protect the massive influx of 800,000 refugees fleeing into Tanzania. It remains a devastating textbook case study in the failure of the international community to stop mass atrocities.
By July of 1994, the Rwandan Patriotic Front managed to seize control of the country, ending the genocide. So now we're at part 3, rebuilding from zero, the RPF takeover. And they inherited a nation that was utterly, completely destroyed.
Imagine the scale of this challenge. It was monumental. Unprecedented, really. Nearly 1 million citizens were dead. The national leadership was gone. The infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, totally decimated. The economy had completely collapsed. And on top of that, the new government is looking at around 200,000 suspected perpetrators sitting in wildly overcrowded prisons. They're trying to manage hundreds of thousands of displaced persons and a population dealing with unimaginable trauma. The RPF stepped into this massive void, taking absolute control to build a new nation literally from zero.
So how do you even begin to process that many suspects when your formal judicial system is in ruins? Well, they did something fascinating. They looked to their pre-colonial past. They reinvented traditional indigenous community courts called Gakacha. Because the courts were destroyed, these grassroots tribunals were used to try hundreds of thousands of suspects locally. And the goal here wasn't just straightforward punishment. It was about getting the truth out in the open, attempting some form of community-level reconciliation so that people who were once enemies could figure out how to live next door to each other again.
All of this leads us to part 4, the cost of cohesion, 21st century Rwanda. Let's look at the results of the RPF's governance under President Paul Kagame. How exactly has Rwanda achieved its modern stability? And what does this integration actually cost?
Today, modern Rwanda is defined by two very conflicting truths. On one side of the ledger, the achievements are absolutely undeniable. You've got that miraculous 10 to 11% economic growth, huge leaps in the Human Development Index with rising life expectancy, and Kigali being the cleanest city in Africa. But this progress is heavily balanced against some seriously documented concerns. The political environment is tightly controlled. We're talking about the suppression of political opposition, a narrowing of freedom of expression and the press, and serious international concerns about Rwanda's military involvement in neighboring DRC conflicts. It's a developmental success story, for sure, but one built on highly centralized authoritarian control.
So what's the mechanism behind maintaining this internal peace? It's something called the One Rwanda policy. Basically, it's a legal mandate that bans the discussion of ethnicity. You literally cannot refer to yourself or others as Hutu or Tutsi anymore. You are simply Rwandan. The intention makes a lot of sense, right? Forge a single, unified national identity to prevent the deep divisions that fueled the genocide. However, this strict prohibition inadvertently creates a highly controlled political space. Dissenting views can be swiftly silenced under the guise of preventing division.
Ultimately, the history of Rwanda demonstrates, as this quote points out, a proclivity that is not unique to Rwandans, but a broader human propensity to form a very stratified society. Rwanda's history of cyclical state failure isn't just an African story. It's a reflection of a universal human struggle. It perfectly captures that constant tension between our desire to build inclusive, egalitarian societies and that dark human tendency to fall into rigid, oppressive hierarchies that exclude others.
Which leaves us with the final, really vital question. Can a fractured society mandate unity? Look, Rwanda has achieved peace, cleanliness, and undeniable economic growth through strict top-down control and forced assimilation. But can true, lasting reconciliation ever be achieved by simply outlining the discussion of the past? It's a complex question that Rwanda continues to navigate today, and honestly, it's one that the rest of the world should be watching very closely. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.